There's something about rejection that I think is very motivating. It always provided motivation to want to go out and do better. That for sure is a common thread that I have seen with a lot of entrepreneurs that I have worked with, have advised. That is a commonality.
Meet Stephen Marks, capital advisor and managing director of Emmersion, an investment holding company. He breaks down his strategies on navigating macro shifts shaping the future of business and investing.
As much as you can learn through education, through university, until you get that practical experience, that's really, for me, the transition point. To me, that time was all about being resilient because it was high-paced. You had to learn skills on the fly. Part of having to adapt and develop new skill sets made me more resilient because there was times where I maybe didn't have that skill and I had to learn it, I had to hone it.
As you started to kind of develop in your career, gain more success, go into that global perspective, how did you sort of carry that ethos, that impact, that trust going forward in terms of how you wanted to start other businesses, build teams?
What happened was there was a fundamental shift.
All right, welcome back to another episode of Built for This, Stories of a Maverick. I'm your host, Jenna, and this is where we love to explore stories, strategies, and bold thinkers redefining how business, innovation, and impact come together. Today, I'm joined by Stephen Marks, founder of Emmersion Capital, international investor and advisor who has spent his career navigating the intersections of finance, global strategy, and transformation. Stephen's story is one of curiosity, grit, and global perspective, from volunteering in northern Mexico as a teenager and building his first business at just 17, to producing over 400 events across the country and managing family office portfolios through the 2008 financial crisis. His path has been anything but ordinary. Now, through Emmersion Capital, Stephen is focused on solving some of the biggest macro challenges of our time, from AI and eldercare to U.S. and Latin America supply chain shifts and global market movements. In this episode, we're going to unpack how these massive transitions in technology, demographics, and geopolitics are converging and what it means for entrepreneurs, investors, and the next generation of leaders. Welcome.
Jenna, thank you so much. That's one of the best intros anyone's ever given to me, so thank you.
I'm happy to. I love being a good hype woman for anybody that I can. I always say too often we don't get to really have our own highlight reel. We're always so head down and focused on what we're doing that when somebody else talks about us, we're like, oh, we're pretty cool.
Honestly, I could not have written it better myself. So you sequence things out perfectly. So thank you for that.
I appreciate it. Well, I'm excited to dig in, and I always kind of like to start sort of, as I mentioned about the highlights, but kind of where it all began for you, from those sort of early experiences, in Mexico, and sort of how it shaped kind of your trajectory to where you're at now, whether you knew it at the time or it kind of just sort of dominoed from an event that you didn't foresee.
Well, definitely didn't know it at the time. That's for sure. What was real interesting about that period of my life, well, as it is for all of us growing up, you take in, I think, new experiences maybe differently than you do when you get older. And I think there's probably more of an appreciation for something that is new and, in my case, very, very unique. Volunteering in northern Mexico. Now, this would have been the mid 90s. So think just after the trade agreement, North American Free Trade Agreement between the United States, Canada, and Mexico. And this was really before you saw a lot of manufacturing shift from the US and Canada into that region, specifically in northern Mexico. It was a much different place than it is today. And I remember those first experiences going there, and I probably took 7 or 8 trips over the course of high school and into college. And I remember going there and seeing true poverty for the first time. And I had volunteered in Chicago, which is where I'm from, in other parts of the city. So I was able to see poverty, what I thought was poverty. But when you see it at another level, it really opens your eyes to the world. And then it allowed me to experience, I think, a different culture, which that to me there is a direct correlation between the desire to understand new cultures and build relationships in other parts of the world that for sure has carried over today. So at the time, there was no knowledge of this. There was just, I'm going to go and learn some things and learn the language and learn the people, and it turned into something that I have now created through a portfolio that honestly at the time was not possible. So it was really eye-opening experience that really kind of carried over into my early days, my early entrepreneurialism, and new experiencing founding companies.
Yeah, and I'm curious, did you grow up around entrepreneurs? So kind of that spirit was already there in terms of having an experience and then having kind of already the spark to be like, oh, I can just go do something about this, or I could build something right away. Or was it kind of a spark you realized an interest you had because of those travels?
I think there was a few different factors that were at play that may not have even been connected to volunteering and being in Latin America, but one of which is that there are a few entrepreneurs in my family, but really at the time I had an uncle who formed a business, and my mom later in life, after being a nurse for 40 something years, founded a consulting business of which I'm now a partner. But that was much after my first company. And I think part of this is that maybe the desire to want to do something of my own, that is something that I have felt since I was a very young age. I would rather work for myself and my clients than work for someone else. Also, I found out and was not obvious at the time that my grandfather was an entrepreneur. It was not a very good one. He didn't have the education that I had, but he tried different things. He tried to create his own way in the world, and I think there's probably that drive, and a lot of U.S. Americans have that, and it's something that is very unique, I think, to the U.S. American culture that you don't see abroad. But I think that was the foundation, and I would also add another element. I went to DePaul University in Chicago, and at that university, great entrepreneur program, great business school. You're taught by entrepreneurs, you're taught by founders. So there's a lot of just ancillary knowledge that sort of is absorbed at that age that I think has really carried over to today.
And I'm curious if you had an experience, when you're going to school and working with entrepreneurs. I kind of had the flip side where I fell into working for entrepreneurs and I didn't see the theme until like a couple roles in where it's like, oh, you really love working for entrepreneurs, like the crazy ones, these big visions. I'm like, what? Like, hold on a second. It took me a little while to understand what I was leaning in towards, and I liked the kind of impossible as possible drive and being able to have access to a bunch of things that maybe in a larger corporation you wouldn't if you were starting out versus kind of in that startup mentality. And I think some people, from my experience, get very deer in headlight in that and not used to it. And it's like confronting, and there's that drive and resiliency and that pressure to go like faster, work harder, be smarter about it, ask better questions. And I think if you're not willing to kind of be pushed in that way, you're like, this type of environment's not for me. I'm going to go for something a little bit more structured. But that's how I fell in love with it because I was like, oh, for whatever reason, everything about this kind of world lights my soul on fire. And I want to keep figuring out how to learn everything possible. But I'm curious if you kind of like, was it the 17-year-old starting the business that already kind of had the risk tolerance, I'll call it, for it? Or did you kind of have that one moment interacting with one of those people along your initial journey that was like, okay, yes?
It was a very different time than probably, or for sure, where we're at today, in that being a founder was really it's a thing now. I mean, it is very well established, and you've seen whether it's someone like Mark Zuckerberg out of his dorm at Harvard, then grow Facebook into Meta, and you have all of these tangible examples of what a potential trajectory could be for an entrepreneur. But I remember back in the 90s, there really weren't so many of those examples. Like people were starting to talk about it then, and you were starting to learn about, I think, innovation just more in general. And you get stories about Bill Gates and Steve Jobs, and obviously that run that Apple had in the late 90s into the 2000s, I think was very impactful for me because you could sort of see how you can just create something and turn what was an idea into reality. But I think back then it was just it was very different. Now it's more of an industry now. And I think venture capital supports that, and a lot of these success stories play into that narrative. But at the time, picking up as much as you can, and I think it was much more real world oriented. It was, okay, you need to sell in order to get revenue, which is such a basic concept now when companies are just burning money. And it's like, okay, we have a runway for 3 years and we don't have to generate revenue. But back then, it's 17, 18. It was like, no, you need to generate revenue now. Otherwise, you can't pay your bills. Now, I also have I had a lot of safety in that my parents were still supporting me back then. So I always had a soft landing if I needed it. But at the time, it was just very different. And I'm sure for you, it probably is something a little similar. But do you think that these are skills that you sort of learn, or do you think in your experience, entrepreneurs are born? I'm curious to get your perspective.
Yeah, I actually talk with a lot of people about this because it's kind of like the nature versus nurture model, in my opinion, of, what are the commonalities. And when I was at Summit, there was a great talk about high performers and psychopaths and the similarities between the two, and then where those traits kind of go dark and stormy versus where they're used for good. And an amazing behavioral psychologist was digging into it. I'm like really trying to get him to record with me because he's so fascinating. Because he's interviewed serial killers, worked with like venture and like does behavioral profiles. And I've definitely worked for, I would call some of them some psychopathic traits for sure in terms of how they operate. But I would say generally, when I think about, you talked about Steve Jobs having like the run, and there was a same thing with like an Elon Musk. There's a lot of glamour around them, but they're also not necessarily known for being the best human. And like you hear about their
Good
struggles with
point.
like family and relationships and, being able to turn it off and not always think about the bottom line or stretching and pushing people past that point. I think there's that fine line of inspiring, pushing, and like holding accountability, but then also knowing when somebody is at their max
Yeah.
and knowing how to support them through that versus firing them because in that moment they can't meet you where you're able to go. And so I think there's like my experience with working with the entrepreneurs, all of them have a chip on their shoulder from something. And whether that was like the poor kid growing up who everybody doubted, who said they weren't smart enough and kind of got into that, or, something else that caused this need to like to prove themselves in some kind of way. And then they all have like, and I think that pairs with this unparalleled work ethic that they will not stop. They will get beaten down 25 times. They will get up 26 times because their belief in whatever they're up to is so strong that they're willing to kind of sacrifice themselves in order to make it happen.
I think you're onto something there.
Yeah.
And I would say now, and I'm not necessarily speaking from my own experience, but
Yeah.
I do think this is very accurate in how you're describing it for part of my experience, but also now talking to founders and hearing from them as well, is that, there's something about rejection that I think is very motivating. And for sure, it is a motivation factor for me. And it's has always been, and I don't really understand why. I couldn't give you the reason right now because I honestly don't know it. But I remember feeling very early on when I was rejected for, let's say, a business opportunity or whatever, it always provided motivation for me to want to go out and do better. And I think that for sure is a common thread that I have seen, at least with a lot of entrepreneurs that I have worked with, have advised. But yeah, that is a commonality.
Yeah, it's really fascinating, and it's always those kind of one of my favorite interview questions, especially if it's like C-level or kind of down, is to understand resilience. So, like, talk to me about the toughest moment you've ever experienced. How did you bounce back from it? And like, what did it look like? And you learn a lot about how somebody processes pain and like what the magnitude of that moment is. Because sometimes you'll have people like, oh, my cat died and it was tough. And you're like, okay. And then you have somebody who just tells you they're like, oh my goodness, I can't imagine going through that. And then it was like, here's what I learned. Here's how I transformed that pain. Here's what I'm not willing to do again. And really create their path to go forward in a really productive way. So you can see which like personalities pair really well with founders because of kind of that grit. And it's always the top thing that entrepreneurs want. I want people who are resilient. I want that grit. And you're like, well, I don't think you can actually teach grit. I think grit is something you're born with.
Totally agree. Or something you experience.
Yeah.
Completely agree.
Yeah. And I think it depends whatever shapes you, and everybody's definition or reasons why they got grit can be totally different. And some I'll call it way more traumatic than others, but it's this
Right.
fascinating thing, you know? And I
Yep.
think sometimes the people who seem like they've had the easiest ride are actually the ones that have experienced the most trauma and have just understood how to bounce back from it and not let it define them, but push them forward, which I find fascinating. And I love working like with people who have that.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree anymore with what you just said. Totally agree.
I love it. So if we're kind of bring to that grit and you're mentioning like you've always recognized you've had this need to like kind of prove yourself and you know that if I get rejected, okay, that gives me some like fuel. I recognize that I want to kind of prove you wrong in a way. So how did you kind of get into the world you're in now, and how did that come to sort of really be your platform of like, oh, I have something here?
Well, it started with what I would call the formal investment education. And that was coming out of university. I started working with families who owned assets, and that was my first foray into the family office space, the private equity space, and then also some venture capital as well. And as much as you can learn through your own company or through education, through university, until you get that practical experience, that's really for me, the transition point. And what was fascinating about that was that you talk about resiliency. To me, that time was all about being resilient because it was high paced. You had to learn skills on the fly. And especially when you're in a family office type of situation on the smaller side as well, but you see it into the middle market, that sometimes these family offices, you get plugged into a lot of different things, whether it's portfolio management, but then also, hey, you need to understand what property management is because we own a large commercial real estate portfolio as well. And so you have to adapt. And I think that was part of having to adapt and develop new skill sets made me more resilient because there was times where I maybe didn't have that skill and I had to learn it, I had to
Yeah.
hone it. And then also coming out of that, the first couple of years, we started getting into the Great Recession,
Yep.
2008, 2009, which if you were to ask anybody about my age who works in investment and was working at investment at that time, they will say that they learned everything that they could during that like 2-year period. And that's how it was for me. I mean, I think about 2009, my memories of 2009 are just dark. All I can think about is like Chicago winter. It's like January and February, but for the entire year. Like I don't remember the sun ever coming out in 2009 because everything was just so bleak. And there were specific examples. I mean, we had a property, a few properties with a regional bank that ended up failing. And all of a sudden, you're getting a call from the FDIC at 5:01 on a Friday. It's like, hey, we need you to open up properties for us because we're taking over the bank, so we could open up operations on Monday. I mean, credit providers were failing, entire properties were failing, going bankrupt. It was just this time where I remember calling my father almost every day during that time period just to compare notes on what was going on in the US and globally because it was just so transformational. And that moment was really, it made a lasting impression on me to this day.
Yeah. And I'm curious because for that time, you mentioned the darkness, and outside of, I'll call it even just like the asset management, the people component of it. So there's people, I'll call it kind of almost like a heartbreak central because a bunch of things are falling apart and, people getting really affected on a very serious level. And so being kind of on the finance asset management side, How did you kind of, I guess, even maybe compartmentalize sort of like business versus impact? And then also, there's this capitalist component of looking like, where's the opportunity in all of this to make more money?
I think compartmentalize is probably the right term, because what I ended up doing is that I had to, each day was a grind. And,
Yeah.
and it felt like as time went on, it just started wearing on me more and more and more. There's a few different initiatives that I took at that time. The first was to start expanding my thinking a little more globally and looking outside the US, and for the first time probably ever, associating risk to the United States, which I think even nowadays, I think that is a very good thing to be thinking about diversification and other markets and where opportunity might exist and where more stability, long-term stability might exist outside of just the United States. And the other thing on a personal level that I did is that I actually started a nonprofit that worked with families who were essentially losing their homes and providing not only base level finance education for them, but then also helping them to negotiate with the banks to keep them in their home if it could be saved, giving them a soft landing if the home couldn't be saved. So there was a few different things that I probably serendipitously just picked up
Yeah.
on how to just cope with that time period, because you're going from doing a lot of transactions to virtually nothing.
Yep.
And it felt like it was overnight.
Yeah, and I think that's really powerful, also kind of balancing a way to learn, grow, and understand business in a different way, but also I think from a very human level, which sometimes I feel like, especially today, is a little bit lost in terms of how, at the end of the day, the humans are going to be affected. And it's always this interesting thing I think about of, technology and it moving so fast and all these human components getting removed and like, okay, I get it. Some of these tools are really, really cool and really effective and they're fun to play with, but like, oh, yeah, that's like definitely somebody's job. And like,
What does
okay,
that mean? What does this mean? Like, are we talking about this? Like, where are we going with this? You're 100%
yeah.
correct.
And it draws me back to, and I mean, he got tons of slack for it when it first came out, which is like Andrew Yang, like the universal basic income. And
Yep.
it was like,
Yep.
poof, right away. Everyone's like, that's stupid. I'm like, no, that's actually exactly where we're headed. Like,
Yes. I think he should have been Commerce Secretary during the Biden administration. I think he was so far ahead of the game in terms of thinking about how AI and automation is going to disrupt our daily lives. And you're right, like nobody paid attention to that. But I remember thinking at the time, like, he's probably 2 or 3 years too early on this, but this is the conversation we need to be having now.
yeah, and just the community aspect, and even I try to
Yeah.
feel like, oh, it'll whether it's a credit system, whether there's some means of like actual monetary value attached, it will be like teaching other people languages, cooking classes, gardening projects together. And I mean, Galloway and like his, now book launch and Men and Loneliness, like there's all this drawback to humanity and people, and it's such an interesting thing to talk about, but also there's just literally like no focus or kind of really path to make sure. And you mentioned like soft landing, that there is some sort of not rock bottom eruption, basically, and not just like this is actually how we're going to transition people. These are already like the community groups that we're going to start, and these are going to be the perks or the benefits that you get from, I don't know, just like talking to your neighbor and figuring out some sort of like friendly exchange that both of you benefit from.
That's spot on. One of our thesis for the next couple of years is to really focus on the experiential and how automation and AI is going to impact our one-on-one experiences or our collective experiences. And I think you're going to see more and more opportunity and more emphasis on what you just said, cooking classes and dance classes and learning languages in groups and continued travel, which we've seen coming out of the pandemic, concerts, films and the arts. And I think that is going to be the pushback against AI, is that and it may take a while for people to realize this, and some people may never realize this at all, but that we're becoming so dependent on screens and that there is going to be a pushback. Well, what does that mean for our lives? And I think that actually leads to an opportunity. And that's something that, like I said, we are going to actively want to invest in and look at this more globally on creating a platform.
Yeah, and I'm hopeful some of those things come sooner versus later, but it is this interesting AI bubble and this race to, get all these platforms going and be AI first technology. And like without a doubt, everybody's gonna have some sort of AI enabled tool to help run their business to be more efficient. Like I don't think we're escaping that. And I think there's certain things that by no means no human really wants to do that. Sure, if you can automate that and I don't have to do it, we love it. But also how do we continue to grow, evolve, challenge, and then not leave majority of the world behind because a selected group of people are the ones kind of in control and, running things. And it's parallels like another book of Life 3.0 by Max Tegmark and like what these like AI operated bubble worlds robots look like. And I think it's a very interesting time that we're plowing right into. So I'm curious to see how that goes. And I'm kind of wanted to talk about, you having that lens. And obviously it's clear kind of early on when you mentioned starting that like nonprofit and wanting to have that impact. So as you started to kind of develop in your career and kind of gain more success and scale and kind of go into that global perspective, how did you sort of, carry that I'll call it that ethos, that impact, that trust going forward in terms of how you wanted to work with families, start other businesses, build teams that were really kind of aligned with how you were starting to look at the world?
What happened was there was a fundamental shift coming out of the Great Recession where early part of 2010, I started to close deals again. And it was at a fairly rapid rate over that first 6 months. Like I said, 2009 was very dark, but I remember 2010 being very bright. And that was a really interesting moment for me because at that point I had already formed our advisory business, which the thesis I had coming out of the Great Recession was around diversification. And this drawing in my early experiences volunteering, I had let's call it more of an itch to look at where opportunities were abroad. And I started evaluating Asia versus Latin America in particular. Emerging markets have always fascinated me. And I think a lot of with supply chains pivoting into Asia, Mexico, that I thought, there's probably something there that I could maybe piece together. And what ended up happening is that I started the advisory business and I was working with family offices and private equity and other types of investors who were looking to invest in the Latin American market. I
Yeah.
still had remembered Spanish. I had to pick up some words again. It had been a couple of years before I had used them. But also, that's when I started to expand into other geographies. And I remember the first opportunity that I worked on in Chile was a real eye opener for me because culturally was so very different. I also would say compared to the other parts of Latin America at the time, Chile was a soft landing. There was a lot that was happening there, but also fundamentally from a regulatory perspective, it's safe. And it allowed me to really build a niche on cross-border investment, cross-border M&A, but then ultimately using some of the resources and working with teams offshore, nearshore to then help build the portfolio in the United States, that transition point happened about 8 years ago where we started looking at and investing into smaller companies that we could then take and develop scale by using some of these resources. So there is an organic approach to how things sort of scaled and grew through the 2010s that really led to where things are at today. And that's continued growth, but then also looking at a few interesting angles demographically, regionally, globally that are shifting that we could potentially benefit from.
Yeah. And For you kind of being that differentiator, and I think kind of comes down to being that being an adaptable and again seeing things. But sometimes I think in finance too, you can focus on the short term of what can make you money right now, which is versus what's going to make you money 5 years, 15 years from now. So, from your perspective, was it always kind of looking at it from being more of a long term thinker versus like short term in the world as you started to look at kind of that investment sort of like ethos in terms of what you wanted to build and how you were looking at things versus kind of just more like very transactional and kind of get my money, get out, and move on to the next thing?
I would say that the transactional approach, I'm still very transactional to this day. Just love doing deals. But I would say I was much more short term in my thinking 10 years ago than I am today. And I would say in the past 5 years, I have fundamentally shifted into thinking more long term. And there's, as an example, that there's opportunities that 10 years ago we started working on and trying to build out or had some idea of a platform that still have not come into fruition today, but we're getting closer. It's all about timing. I think from an investment perspective, timing means everything. And sometimes you're not at the right moment in order to go and invest into a new platform or a new opportunity, but that time may come. And I think that what has happened, if you look at private equity in particular, private equity in the 2010s was the horizons were much more short term. And you're looking at like a 5-year horizon, 7-year max on some of these investments. And now these private equity funds can't sell their companies 7, 8, 9, 10 years after acquiring them. And I think they're learning that really, if you want to create value, that's a long-term approach. And I think you need to be patient enough, which a lot of people don't have, but you need to be patient enough to let things play out, let things grow. And then in the long term, you can either sell that asset or it can almost become like an annuity to you and you can just hold it and pass it along to the next generation if you want to.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And so, in terms of kind of, that varying markets, and then you come out of 2008 and very recently like year was very like bear market, lots of like holds on IPOs, and like everybody's waiting to see what's going to happen, and some of those like we'll call it was called like the big sexy companies that if you were invested you're waiting and like what's going to happen. And, now that market's starting to move, but I also think it's very valid what you said of the shift from a venture perspective of that one, companies are staying private longer because they need time to grow, but also they don't want the harassment and mess of like venture being like, okay, we want to sell you. We're breaking up parts of it to kind of get some liquidity underneath them to be able to invest in kind of the latest and greatest thing that they're after. And I think a lot of people throughout their career tenor those storms really well and have been through multiple financial crises and like different markets. And so nothing really rattles them. And it kind of comes back down to that like resiliency point where you can really kind of navigate that storm really well. And you know when to kind of tighten up things and when you kind of have to move with that flow and speed because it's a limited window. And so I'm curious for you kind of how you view it, how you stay grounded navigating, those kind of markets.
For me, I love disruption because that always means there's some type of opportunity. When things are going well and there aren't a lot of macroeconomic or global factors that are impacting capital movement, I don't really see a lot of opportunity. But when things are upside down, there's always buyers and there's always sellers. And being in the middle of that and seeing those opportunities is a good place to be. I think what we have seen just in the past 10 months is really creating, I think, a lot of smaller opportunities that maybe before private equity or family offices or asset managers were not paying attention to, but they are now. The geographies that I work in, Latin America, United States, Canada, Europe, you're seeing a lot more cross-border movement that didn't exist 10 months ago. You're seeing it in both directions. So we have economic stress in the United States, while Latin America has had economic stress for 10 years. So you're seeing movement inter-LATAM, LATAM to the United States, LATAM to
Yeah.
Europe, United States to LATAM, United States to Europe. I mean, it is, things are all over the place. And I think you coming out of those moments of stress in like the Great Recession, 2008, 29 or 2009, prepare you for moments like this where you can stay grounded, to your point, and be aware and be listening and be patient, because there's always something there's going to be an opportunity that presents itself.
Yeah. And I'm curious from your perspective, as you start to look at companies and you're meeting with different, founders, or as you mentioned, you love to close deals, and kind of coming back down to the traits perspective, given everything that you've experienced from an investment and sort of family office perspective, because you had, different interests, different goals, depending sometimes on who you're working with. Are there any kind of sort of key traits that you're looking for in founders or partners, while you're maybe doing deals in an uncertain time?
Creativity, number one. But I think creativity grounded in a fundamentally sound business approach is crucial, because and I'm sure you have seen this,
Yeah.
the people who take creativity to the extreme where it's not really based in reality. And, but the flip side of that is that the smartest investors, founders, families
Yeah.
that I know, business owners, CEOs, they are very creative in their approach, and they're always adapting to the circumstances. And you think about now where there is this window of opportunity that exists through automation, through a changing marketplace, through changing global supply chains, global realignment to more of a regional model. That creates so many opportunities to be efficient, to develop fundamentally sound enterprises. And that to me is something it's one of the top things I look for. And not everybody has that. And that is something it's very hard to find. But knowing that I try to align myself with as many people who are like that as possible, because usually there's a good result from that relationship, from that partnership that comes from it.
And I wonder if it's the same for you. I was kind of surprised as I was talking to some investment bankers, some business brokers recently, and I was talking about teams, and they're talking about closing a deal, and founders being difficult, or the other company wanting take out one of the C level, or like they want to buy it, but that founder is out. And I was asking about the assessment of the leadership. Like, do you have anybody looking at, like, does that actually make sense? Or what is the culture of that company, and how have their teams built? Because I mean, sometimes you have the charismatic, charming founder who will say checks a bunch of boxes, and in a lot of ways they do, but their gifts are not people management. And they need the in between person to help translate that, because otherwise, from my experience, people feel like they're constantly, depending on who they work with, they're not good enough, or it's pivoting so much that they just feel like there's no alignment on actual, like, a path forward. And generally teams want that. Where are we headed? How are we going to get there? This is the plan. In some businesses, it's much easier to have that longer term plan, which is sustainable. But sometimes when you're a startup growing, the pivots are happening quickly. And I was surprised to see that, like, not too many deal teams on either side were really kind of looking at that. And I was like, oh my goodness, this is a really interesting opportunity for me to help you actually either like add value if you're looking to buy it, or negotiate and like do something different on another side. They're like, yeah, we haven't really thought about that. We're just in it to like close that deal and move on to the next. I'm like, interesting that nobody's also considering the people in this transaction.
For sure. And it's interesting that you're picking up on that,
Yeah.
because that is something that we have seen in our approach
Yeah.
be incredibly valuable for whether it's our investor partners or even clients of ours.
Yep.
We have a portfolio company of ours called Apertura. Apertura takes like the top 1% of talent from Latin America, a lot of finance roles, cybersecurity, civil and commercial engineers, but it's we take that talent and we put them into the US middle market, startups, lower middle market as well. And part of the due diligence process that we get pulled in on for, let's say, private equity or even venture or whatever family offices, one of the things that we're always offering to them is really like our qualitative perspective of that founding team or of that existing management team. Because it's one thing to just be looking at the quantitative data and pull a quality of earnings report, and we can show you, okay, things are checking off or give you an audit. But there's another component to this, which is, okay, well, what are the strengths and weaknesses of this founder team? How could they be incorporated into a broader strategy? Can they be, or are there resources that they need to be paired with? Or is there technology that they need to incorporate in order to become more efficient? Whatever it might be. So it's interesting to see that, or to hear that you're seeing this as well through your own analyses.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really interesting. And so, yeah, an area for me that I really want to like delve into more is that because I just think there's just so many pieces missing. And then some people even asking tough questions like, how many of the people actually want to move? Have you also just asked the truthful question? Like, some might just be done and like over it. And like, that's okay. Let's not try to do like square peg, round hole here and force them into a situation. And then you create that toxicity across, and that's just going to domino and, you know, however that transition looks, even from a change management perspective, is just going to get so much more difficult. But I think just because when I was like, well, people are the hardest part, people are messy. I'm like, yeah, they are messy. And I was like, but
Yeah.
there can be better ways where they're actually like,
Yeah.
treat them like humans and like a lot of honesty and tough conversations followed up with like a clear output and path forward to at least, even if sometimes the outcome's not ideal for somebody, at least they
Yeah.
can say they weren't surprised, it was handled with integrity, and, like, they knew exactly what was coming.
That's right.
Like,
Absolutely. Yep.
other than the
Completely agree.
massive, Zoom recording firing that
Yep.
used to go viral,
Yeah. That's right. Yes.
And so, I mentioned when we talked about, like, tools and people getting, possibly moving into new roles and having to learn different things, kinda coming back from to the AI side of things, you know talk to me about kind of how you're looking at that from an investment perspective, sort of, capital moving in and out. I know some people are kind of waiting because there's so much going into AI and every tool possible. But even, as you look at it from the multiple markets and a global perspective, is there, a way in which you're sort of looking and moving in this new world?
When we were talking earlier about the changes to labor, that to me is probably the most impactful change that will happen. And I'm not on the side of, well, everything is going to be automated, everything
Yeah.
is going to be robotic. I think that the answer is probably, but also at the same time, not you, things are going to be automated. So
Yeah.
I'm for sure somewhere in the middle of
Yeah.
this conversation, as I think it is very reasonable to be thinking about what is going to happen over the next 5 to 20 years globally in the United States, and how automation could be helping, I think, to solve some of these problems, but then also what are the problems going to be? And so what's been interesting is that we haven't been thinking very collectively until recently about how the trends of US aging population, uh, great wealth transfer that will be happening in the next 10 to 25 years from baby boomers to Gen X to millennials. Also looking at the impacts of the labor market because of automation. Nobody seems to be talking a lot about what all of that means. And I think we're in a very unique position where the portfolio is focused on some areas where we believe specialized automation is going to exist,
Yeah.
and that needs to be supported, and there might be human in the loop always,
Yeah.
or maybe not. But at the same time, I think it's reasonable to say next 5 years, probably human in the loop. You're gonna need a team
Yeah. You're
that
the
is backing that.
operator of it. Yeah.
You're gonna need an operator, that's right. Now, The other side of this, we have a healthcare business, an elder care management business called Infirmera that works with families who are aging. And so what we're seeing is that we're seeing 80-year-old, 90-year-old patients who are declining, and they're being taken care of by their 60, 70-year-old kids who are the next in line for this transition into that more geriatric senior age group. Well, they own businesses. What are going to happen with those businesses? What's going to happen when they retire? 6 million, there's 6 million small businesses in the United States with at least one employee. That's a lot of businesses. And if they own 20%, which I think is a conservative number, you're talking like 1.2, 1.5 million small businesses in the United States where the owners are probably going to retire. Well, what does that mean for basic services? Will that be replaced by automation? Probably not fully,
Yeah.
but where can we maybe create a solution? And this goes back to, we think about labor. Apertura, our portfolio company, is working in the US middle market because they can't hire engineers, they can't hire analysts, they can't hire accountants. So
Yeah.
we think we're in a really unique position to be investing into and supporting, let's call it human in the loop,
Uh-huh.
operated AI solutions that are more specialized, that are more niche, that don't have crazy high valuations, and also thinking about the services and the impact macroeconomically about what's going to happen in those trends over the next 5 to 25 years. Because we've never seen a moment like this where all of these factors, global realignments, are all coming together at the same time. And like I said, we feel like we're in a good position to answer that.
Yeah, and I see this similar kind of things happening in Canada as well from like an elder care perspective where there is a massive amount of an aging population, but also situations where there is no kids that can take care of them. Income may be limited, and they need housing, they need care, and all those different degrees of care. But then also, being someone's based in Vancouver, real estate is very expensive. So where are these builds gonna go? Like lower income for like it's a big discussion. And I know some nonprofit organizations have had funding pulled recently because of, budget cuts. And you think about, ramifications of all that is more and more people are kind of getting moved out of these roles or closing them down and not really having this backup plan or some sort of massive retirement plan. And, I've come up in the age of like, what's a pension plan? What company offers a pension plan? I don't know what that even means. Like, unless you work for government, like, that's the only job that I know offering pension plans. Like, and
Right.
so it's so funny when I might talk to my parents about it. I'm like, yeah, that would have been nice. I think you guys were the era of like being able to really have that and like built in, or you stayed in a job for your whole life. Versus now, people shift and you're on to the next thing. And, some people luck out and end up getting, stocks and they get to cash out versus, it's a long-term incentive that never pans out. And, the more that I dig into it and you see kind of all the different factors happening, sort of opportunity also meets chaos, also in the midst of like such a massive
Yes.
problem where, like, I sometimes spin myself into, like, I don't even know what to do. Like, I see things happening, but it's such a big problem, and I have no idea if the smartest minds are working on this, like, if it's enough change. So I'm curious as you're have the piece of hope, in terms of how your portfolio is doing and being able to kind of work with companies where you see solution. How do you balance also not just being, like, completely overwhelmed by the mess?
And that is overwhelming is the right descriptor because it truly is. You
Yeah.
think about the conversation is all around automation, which I absolutely, we need to be having this conversation.
Yeah.
But we're not talking about the fact that 10,000 people in the United States are turning 65 every single day and have been, I think, for 6 or 7 years and will continue to until 2030. So what does that mean long term? And I think it's really easy to get trapped into the bigness of this, of all of this global realignment, movement of supply chains and macroeconomic changes. But if you focus on providing real world solutions and go very deep with those solutions, that does give you hope because you know you're filling a gap. And I look at the portfolio and I can honestly say that Infirmera filling the eldercare gap, Apertura filling the labor gap for technical labor in the United States, One Source, supply chains, moving supply chains into friendly jurisdictions like Latin America. There's real world solutions that are being created that I think outside of even our own portfolio, founders are giving those solutions. And I think it's just a matter of staying focused and
Yeah.
not broadening to things. And in that way, you're hopefully worrying at least a little bit less,
Yeah, no, that's
maybe not
fair.
more.
And you mentioned kind of in the beginning how when you were going to school, the I'll call it the term founder or that kind of being a role was a little, I'll call it less glamorous than it is today, or, not as necessarily a title that as many people held. As you look at kind of the next generation of founders coming up and, opportunities and we'll call it creativity, where do you think amidst the kind of, I'll call it the excitement of this AI bubble, they should sort of be kind of focusing that energy and that ability to kind of position themselves in a really impactful way, sort of in the next 10 years?
Well, you touched on someone earlier that I listened to as well, Scott Galloway, who he said this recently, and I think he was spot on, which he was talking about how younger generations should be trying to learn as much as they can with as many different experiences as they can now or as they're coming up through the workforce and
Yes.
utilizing tools, but then also being able to like go out, talk to your colleagues, network, get out in the real world,
Yeah.
learn hard lessons, which I think is all very valuable. But there's another opportunity that I see, and this goes back to that conversation about retirement and wealth transfer,
Yeah.
that there's going to be a lot of businesses that are going to want to sell. And I'd say smaller ones, lower middle market companies. And that is a really interesting opportunity. And Scott mentioned this. That's a really interesting opportunity to do an apprenticeship under a current business owner, figure out a way to do some seller financing to then sell that company to maybe a younger founder or entrepreneur who can then go into that business, create efficiencies, use technologies, develop new opportunities. And I think, I really hope younger generations are looking for those types of opportunities outside of, hey, I just want to create a startup. I want to raise venture capital, because that's a really hard path right now to do. And you're seeing it, I'm sure. It's not as realistic as it was 10 years ago to then raise these crazy rounds. And with a business, it's ultimately not profitable. So I think that's what I would pass along to the younger generations is build the skill set, but then also look for those unique opportunities where you could maybe own a business with some advisors and some support and get creative and help create a solution for that generation that's also retiring.
Yeah. And I think it kind of what's come up too is sort of those, as you mentioned, kind of like legacy businesses where, again, if they pass away, it's sort of kind of started with them and unfortunately in some cases going to die with them, whatever that looks like. But it's this interesting shift, I think, in a world that's emphasized technology so much and like get into school, learn how to code, like everything tech that I always say like the trades have kind of been lost. Like
Oh,
especially with
for
all the
sure.
building, like the amount of like carpenters, electrical, any trades role. I'm like,
Yep.
hey, if I wanted
Plumbers.
job security, if I would go back, that's what I would go train to do
Yep.
and learn, get my ticket in basically everything.
Yep.
And you can,
Yeah.
build really cool cultures and projects and like build that because AI is not like I don't for my not coming for that or I don't think it's going to be might speed up booking and help you in a bunch of tools, but I think this literal building with your hands and what that looks like even from like landscaping, all those things is such an interesting opportunity because there is a lot of small businesses that don't know what to do with that, and if you can get in, buy it, then it pick up a next one and continue to expand. It's not the sexy thing of right now, but
No.
it's a great business.
Very profitable,
Yeah.
and I'm right there with you. You don't necessarily need to go into the field of finance
Yeah.
to be successful, and there's other paths, or technology, to your point, that there are
Yes.
other paths. Learn a trade, learn how manufacturing, especially automated manufacturing, because those jobs are really going to be in demand. And I think those younger people who understand that they need to pivot to those types of opportunities are going to be very successful. If you're in a city like Boise, Idaho, or a smaller market where they're lacking talent, they're lacking younger people to come in and take these types of jobs, that's a great opportunity. Those secondary markets, there's a lot. And I talk to bankers, I talk to business owners and CEOs and all of in those markets, and they all say the same thing, is that there's just not enough younger people moving here to fill these jobs and opportunities. So I think the trades are a great opportunity.
Yeah, and kind of coming back to what you said, and also, repeating what Scott Galloway said of, younger people getting out to travel, connect, see other things, you know, what kind of role, now that you can kind of look back at those trips younger, do you kind of see those relationships and kind of cultural understanding in terms of sort of like navigating the shift? I, like you, kind of saw that I was in Africa when I was younger and then got to be in all these different places and
Amazing.
communities. And it shifted how I thought about the world, how small my like knowing and understanding was, but also kind of always like the first world problems of it all and this different way to look at it, but also what is the way with like the way in both communities grow, learn, how can it be a win-win? And obviously you kind of shifted that of you mentioned like Chile, and I know from my experience like Argentina and developers and getting them to kind of come in for virtual working with companies. I start to see shifts with businesses being more open to that than they were before. And then obviously for some cases it is a discounted labor in comparison to what you're paying in Canada or US for some of those at that time, those like high paid tech roles that have now come down, that it's less of a subject matter expertise role. But I'm curious, as you look back of sort of how you've looked at those relationships and how they've transitioned to kind of how you view them today.
I think it's all about relationships, and you learn so much from building a friendship or a partnership with people in other countries from different cultures with different backgrounds and different experiences, men and women, and it's just you need that diversity of thought in order to then inform your own decision making. And I can't tell you the amount of times, because it still happens to this day, where I could be at our office in Brazil, and I'll be talking to a partner there, or I'll be talking to an advisor there, or someone that I know there, and they're telling me something that just changes my perspective completely. And I think, coming from the United States and the suburbs of the United States, is that it's very easy to be in a bubble, and to think that, well, this is the world, and really it's not. And I think the lessons that are learned by people of other cultures who maybe had a very different upbringing, or really hard circumstances that
Yeah.
I never have had to experience, I think provides lessons towards resiliency and being adaptive to new circumstances and new business approaches. And to it's just been so rewarding
Yeah.
having partners in other countries that I can really learn from, and to inform my own thinking.
Yeah. I think that's such an important statement, the diversity of thought. And I run into interesting dynamics sometimes when building teams because a lot of people want to like attracts like, or you want to work with like sometimes. I'm like, okay, interesting. Like, yes, but if we have five yous, where are we getting with that? And like, yes, you might all like to do the same things, but we're not building like your friendship group. We need people that are going to challenge. And are you able to take people who are going to think differently than you and become better because of it? Or are you willing to shift an approach if somebody says, like, I think that could be done differently? Or like, my experiences taught me this. And I think even outside of a work culture, even from a global, when you talk about like the global shifts and all these things happening, the absence of diversity of thought at the table and people wanting to have those conversations and not make it become like a nuclear thing and just actually learn and take it and be like, "Oh, okay." And again, you mentioned it'll pivot a perspective. We can still fundamentally disagree on something. But if it changed the way I now look at that and I can understand that, then it's gonna shift and adapt how I approach everything, whether I know it in that moment or if it's a year from now. And I think that's what everybody needs a little bit more of in their day to day.
Oh, absolutely. I think the ability to disagree is so important right now. To disagree and then to get along is really something that is just vastly missing in today's
Yeah.
day and age. But you really, as I said before, there's been many times where I have gotten a new perspective with, and it maybe was my own thinking based on my own experiences where I learned that actually no, I'm fundamentally I'm wrong because someone else who had a different experience opened my eyes to that. And that happens, as I said, it happens more often than not, which I'm very grateful for.
Yeah, I always at the moment where I always think I would never do that, and then I hear the story of why somebody did that, I'm like, "Oh, if that happened to me 100%, I would do that." Like, I just haven't had that experience, so it just seems so like, no
Yeah,
way. I think it's always the humility in it where you can, you make the best decision you can at a time with the information you have and what you know, and then once you have more, you should be able to change and adapt because you have new information or the way you thought has changed
that's
than it
right.
was a few years ago. No, that's really exciting. I love all of that. So I want to kind of take our conversation and sort of round it out with some rapid fire questions for you. I always love this question because everybody's is a little bit different. What's your kind of go-to like daily ritual? This keeps you grounded in the midst of a global crisis and or just everyday life.
That's a great question because it's something I need to go back to doing because things have just been too chaotic recently and it feels as if I'm constantly putting out fires. But what really keeps me grounded first thing in the morning is drinking coffee and reading. And I'm pulling in different news sources all over the globe. I'd say with a high concentration, United States, Canada, Europe, but then also Latin America, Colombia, Brazil, Mexico, Chile, and really just trying to learn as much as I can about what's happening in those countries and to like what we just discussed, getting a new perspective.
And what's one book or we'll call it a thought leader that sort of shaped your worldview the most?
I'm going to give you two.
Yeah.
So the first was, and this is about resiliency, but what caused or created resiliency with me, which
Yeah.
is the Great Recession, Too Big to Fail, Andrew Ross Sorkin.
Yep.
And the second one that I'll give to you is a great book called The Outsiders, and it's by William Thorndike, and it's about 8 unconventional CEOs and what they did to grow their businesses, and those stories are very impactful.
Awesome. I haven't heard of that last one. I'm like noted on my next list to read.
Check it out.
Yeah, I'm excited. I love a good book. You talked about resilience. So what would be the one moment that really tested your resilience and how did you push through?
Well, I'd have to go back to 2009 and living in the darkness of that because there were multi-million dollar deals that were just falling apart, and I would say that might have even have been closer to late 2008. And I think that moment where you knew that the world had changed and you knew that you had to grind in order to get through it. That was something I was very well aware of. And it was a battle every day, but also knowing that there was light at the end of the tunnel eventually, that it would come, it gave me a lot of hope. And I think that probably is one of the most impactful time periods of my life.
Hope is very, very important. Which emerging region or industry do you think will surprise people the most in the next decade?
I'm gonna go with the obvious one, and it's not just because I'm a thought leader about Latin America, but I'm gonna say Latin America. Because there's just still a lot that people don't realize about what's happening, I think, on the ground. And you mentioned this earlier, whether it's engineers, tech engineers in Argentina. I mean, we're employing civil and commercial engineers, infrastructure engineers from Brazil and Colombia. We have cybersecurity analysts and engineers from Ecuador, and we have Spain and Mexico, and just the level of talent and the competence of the Latin American labor force is really interesting. And I think the region will continue to surprise people. I think it's gone through a very tough time,
Yeah.
but at some point, I believe that new generations and hopefully some political change
Yeah.
will allow for more of a fundamental change through the region. And that's what I really hope for.
Yeah. And last question, in your own words, define what built for this means to you.
Built for this means to me, it means being resilient, being creative, and being globally minded.
I love that. And so, if anybody is listening and wants to get connected with you to learn more about what you're doing, possible investments, or working within one of your portfolio companies, if it sounds like that's an area they want to explore, see opportunities in, what is the best way to either get in touch or learn more about what you're up to?
Check out Emmersion Capital. That's with Emmersion with an E.com. You can also find me at stephenmarks.me or find me on LinkedIn, Stephen Marks, Emmersion Capital.
Amazing. I appreciate you taking time. It was so much fun to chat with you about all the different areas and your story kind of growing up to where you're at today. And I look forward to staying connected.
Thank you so much, Jenna. This was really great. Appreciate it.
Thank you.